Good morning. And welcome to this great debate. I know it's very early in the morning, but we have to get started. I'm Sean Lovejoy, one of the conveners with Oksana Tarasova and Thomas Blunier. And all I will do is just introduce our moderator, Julianne Mossinger, who's a senior editor in Nature magazine. And she will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the great debate, is global economic growth compatible with a habitable climate? So just to give you an idea of the structure of the session this morning, we'll start off with a brief introductions of the panelists. Then they'll have about 5 minutes each to explain their positions. And then we'll have a brief discussion between the panelists before opening the discussion to the floor. And we will then come back and forth between the audience and the panelists before finishing off with some concluding statements by our speakers. And if you do have a question or a comment once we open the discussion to the floor, if I can please ask you to make your way to one of the microphones in the middle of the room so that everyone can hear your question. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our very distinguished panel this morning. I'll start at the far end. We have Kevin Anderson. He's Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester, Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, and Research and Scientific Advisor to the Welsh Government's Climate Change Commission. His research interests include the implication of rising emissions on the latest climate science for mitigation and adaptation policy, analysing opportunities for rapid decarbonisation of the UK's energy system in particular, and quantifying the role of international transport in a low-carbon society. He also has decades of professional experience in the petrochemical industry. Next to Kevin, we have Dr. Narasimha Rao. He's a project leader in the energy program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. His professional experience also extends well beyond academia, including 7 years of consulting in the electricity industry in the USA. His expertise includes energy poverty, empirical economics, climate ethics and policy, and in his research he examines the relationship between human development, energy and climate change. Next to Narasimha we have, oh, sorry, I'm very sorry, I'm very sorry. Sorry, so we have, between Kevin and Narasimha we have Professor Clive Spash. He's Chair of Public Policy and Governance at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. He's an economist with core interests in interdisciplinary research on human behavior, environmental values, and the transformation of the world political economy to a more socially and environmentally just system. He has worked on a wide range of topics, including biodiversity valuation and policy, and the economic and ethics of human-induced climate change, including a critique of carbon emissions trading. And then, last but certainly not least, here on my left we have Jørgen Randers. He's Professor Emeritus of Climate Strategy at the Norwegian Business School, where he works on climate and energy issues, scenario analysis, and system dynamics. He spent a third of his life in academia, a third in business, and a third in the world of non-governmental organizations. So he has served as the president of the Norwegian Business School, as well as the deputy director general of the Worldwide Fund for Nature in Switzerland, and has been the chair of 3 Norwegian banks. He also sits on the Sustainability Council of Dow Chemical Company and AstraZeneca. Okay. So thank you to our panel this morning. So can I ask Kevin to start us off, please?
We've had our first disagreement on the panel this morning. Two of us wanted to sit down and use the microphones, and 2 wanted to use the lectern. So 2 of us lost out. I was one of those. So, right, 5 minutes. Is economic growth compatible with a habitable climate? I'm going to take the relatively conventional view of economic growth, so ongoing, generally material progress. I'm going to see it and progress like that. So I'm going to see economic growth in the conventional way that we see it currently. When it comes then to habitable climate, my main question there is, to whom are we referring to when we mean habitable climate? Are we meaning people like us, rich high emitters in the Northern Hemisphere, who think we are fairly invulnerable to things like climate change and other environmental stresses? Are we talking about the poor, the 30 million people living on the coastal strip of Bangladesh and other people around the planet who are much less able to cope with the stresses of climate change and are already struggling to eke out a living in their local environments anyway? Or are we talking about other species and other ecosystems? If it's the poor, then I think it's appropriate for them to define what they think is habitable, and the best attempt that we have of trying to bring their voices together probably points towards a 1 to 1.5 degrees C temperature rise. Anything above that for them is not habitable, and clearly at 1 degree C for many parts of the world that looks already to be too challenging. For the rich parts of the world like us, we think we can build a barrier around ourselves and we'll be okay with 2 degrees C, and no doubt some people think 3 and 4 degrees C are perfectly acceptable as well. When it comes to species, some species are already really struggling, as are many ecosystems, particularly when multiplied by the other stresses that we've imposed upon them. So I think at 1 degree C, some species and some ecosystems will not, the planet will not be habitable at that temperature range. At 2 degrees C, certainly for many, even some of the really big emblematic ecosystems, they will also not be habitable, the planet will not be habitable for them at 2 degrees centigrade. Then you come back to looking at the maths, what I get more involved with, just looking at what are the rates of reduction we would need in mitigation and reducing our emissions to hold to those temperature thresholds of 1 to 2 degrees centigrade. I would say the 1 and 1.5 degrees temperature thresholds have gone. They are no longer viable. So unfortunately for those people, then economic growth was not compatible with a habitable climate. That is true also for many species. We are now stuck with 2 degrees C, an outside chance of 2 degrees C at best. But even for that, I would argue you need draconian cuts in emissions in the order of 10% per annum starting now for people like us. So I think for people like us, if you talk to the economists, no economist will tell you that is possible with economic growth, that would mean really very severe cuts in how we would normally measure economic growth for people like us. But and I would say that is true also at the aggregate level, at the planetary level. But I think you also then have to unpick that and say, well, yeah, but growth is not just about people like us. It's also about the rest of the population, global population as well. And indeed, it's about the many people in their own countries that would never dream of attending events like this. The many poor people in Vienna, or coming from the UK, even greater numbers of poor people. So I think when you come to climate change and thinking about the question here, there's an absolute and there's a relative answer. To me, there's a very clear absolute answer that economic growth is not compatible with a habitable climate at the aggregate level. And at the individual level or at the relative level, for people like us, that remains the case. For the poorer people in our communities, I think they need to be seeing increased economic growth, and that puts greater pressure on the levels of mitigation, the levels of reduction in emissions that we have to bring about, and that is one of the reasons I come to the conclusion for people like us, the world will have to be very different in how we live over the next few decades. But then also for the other species as well. If we want to try and protect some of the real beauty of our planet and the way that it evolves, then I think that also comes to the point where people like us will not have economic growth. So my clear conclusion here is, for people like us, no, we cannot have economic growth. For the poor around the planet, I think it is still compatible with a habitable climate within very much more narrow boundaries than it would have been if we'd actually kept our emissions lower. And for many species around the planet, I think undoubtedly it is not possible to have economic growth with all of the impacts, not just the climate impacts, the wider range of stresses that we're imposing on other ecosystems and live in a habitable climate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Clyde? Thank you.
Okay, so is global economic growth compatible with a habitable planet, or habitable climate? Sorry. What is a habitable climate and for whom? Kevin's already mentioned this. One of the issues about for whom is clearly humans and non-humans and non-human nature, which generally gets forgotten, especially by economists. But why concentrate on the climate? Why don't we just ask, is economic growth compatible with a habitable planet? I mean, look at other things besides climate change. Climate change is one issue in a vast environmental crisis that we are facing. Take one issue, species extinction. Species extinction alone implies that we cannot continue with economic growth from the way that we're running our economy. The World Wildlife Fund, or Wild Fund for Nature, has a Living Planet Index measuring the abundance of over 10,000 species, right? Representative species populations of mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, fish, and so on. Since 1970, that has declined by over 52%, right? So we've halved, since 1970, the populations of over 10,000 representative species. This is a crisis for the planet, right? The non-human species are rapidly disappearing. So let's think, what is economic growth? Why do we need economic growth? What's it for? Mainstream economics, the way that it looks at economic growth, it is material and energy throughput that drives economic growth. An economist's view of the world is totally unrealistic. It has no relationship to biophysical reality. What I mean by that is economists model the economy as a totally isolated system. I mean isolated in the terms of physics. It has no interaction with anything outside of it. The economy operates on the basis of material and energy throughput without looking at where that material comes from and where it goes to, where the energy comes from and where it goes through. What we talk about with economic growth, gross domestic product, is the circular flow of income. Money flows going round and round between firms and consumers that are supposed to match the physical flow. There's no interaction with anything else. So what economic growth is just those flows going faster and faster, round and round, faster and faster, round and round, faster and faster. That's what economic growth is. So there's a real problem in this fictitious world the economists have created of actually relating to anything to do with the environment or environmental problems. The real economy, the real physical, biophysical economy, requires massive inputs of low entropy, energy, and material resources. And that's where biophysical reality is at. So we're totally dependent. What has happened with the modern industrial era, where we have economic growth, which is a new phenomenon in human history, only for 200, 250 years, is that we've actually latched onto low entropy resources, in particular fossil fuels. So fossil fuel energy sources are essential to the modern industrial growth economy. So fossil fuels, of course, as we know from basic laws of physics, thermodynamics, what happens when you use fossil fuels is you create waste. What goes in comes out the other end. There is no destruction, there is no consumption of these things. Everything that we use in terms of resources must come out the other end as waste. What this means is that pollution that's coming out is all pervasive. So fossil fuels go into the economy, carbon dioxide comes out, nitrous oxides come out, methane comes out, inevitably. And yet, what are we told? We're being told that we can have better growth and a better climate. A report by Stern and others and very high-level people at Davos and a whole elite. In Paris, the Paris Agreement, 195 countries agreeing to 1.5 degree target that they want to achieve, which, as Kevin has already pointed out, has way gone, and 2 degrees which we can't achieve with it's a very closing window. They're talking about a 50-50 chance that that's already gone as well. Look at the CO2 equivalent levels. But look at the way that agreement is framed. The opening page of the Paris Agreement is talking about, it refers to a document, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. That was passed 2 months before the Paris Agreement in the UN. What that document does is it promotes economic growth, technology, and industrialization and energy use. It pushes all of these. Goal 8 of this UN resolution is to sustain per capita economic growth of a rate of, and I quote, at least 7% gross domestic product per annum in the least developed countries. Massive economic growth beyond anything that has been seen outside of China in recent years. So, and look at the state of China and its environment. So the Paris Agreement is following suit with this. What it says is that we need, and I quote, accelerating, encouraging, and enabling innovation is critical for an effective long-term global response to climate change and promoting economic growth and sustainable development. Now remember that sustainable development here is being defined as 7% growth rates. Faster? Okay, let me just quote from Stern. This is Stern, what Stern says. Let's have a debate on growth. No, Stern says you cannot criticize growth. What he says is, and I'll quote, to those who want to knock out growth from the objectives, I find they're close to reprehensible. I think to say that we should just switch off growth is to miss the big aspects of what matters about poverty. And so it worries me. It's also politically naive if you turn it into a pissing contest between growth on the one hand and climate and the environment on the other and say you've got to choose. You're setting yourself up for failure. That's Lord Stern's opinion. He doesn't want to debate. That's why they're not here. Invited but not coming, right? They don't want to discuss this because they've already won as far as they're concerned. So what's politically naive, I would say, is to believe that you can shut down this debate, that you can ignore the environmental and social impacts. Carbon pricing is being put forward as the solution, and this shows naivety about economics. Economics is not going to solve the problem through carbon pricing, but maybe we can discuss this in the debate. And the other issue I'd like to discuss in this debate is decoupling. That decoupling will save us, and it will not.
Thank you very much, Chloe.
Good morning. So I'd like to also provide some clarifications, perhaps critiques of the question, just as my predecessors have. And first of all, habitable climate. What do I view as a habitable climate? Currently, we are on track to increasing temperatures by more than 3 degrees centigrade based on what we've seen of pledges of different countries. And to get us on track to the Paris Agreement's stated goal of 2 degrees C or even less is already a daunting task. So to me, I take it as a given that our goal is to achieve at least or even more aggressive 2 degrees C. And for the rest of my discussion, that's kind of my starting point. But I have more issues with the terms global economic growth. So while others have stressed the importance of looking at biophysical realities, economic growth is not an end in itself, of course, but it's also a means towards, at best, a means, in some cases, a necessary means towards human well-being and non-human well-being. And so really, I think the questions that we should be asking is what is the compatibility between improving and enhancing human well-being and habitable climate? And that involves looking at dimensions of well-being beyond economic. And in doing that, we actually have much less of an understanding in the sort of excellent scientific research because the focus has, in fact, been on more conventional growth paradigms. And when we look at that, there's still some growing evidence that we see that there might be opportunities for more compatibility when you look at other dimensions that are not economic. Because a lot of these improvements in well-being are not reflected in GDP, for example, which is a metric of economic growth. So for instance, if you look at air pollution caused by coal plants, if you look at oil spills, for example, those are not, the damages aren't necessarily reflected in economic growth. You can have perverse outcomes where, in fact, they increase economic growth because the damages aren't reflected in it, but reparations are, for example. So that main point I want to stress is we need to look at non-economic dimensions of well-being, and there, as I'll mention a little bit later, we might see some more synergies. The other point is global. So we live in a very, very unequal world, as you've heard before. And this means that we talk about compatibility of growth and well-being and climate. We have to view the world very differently in the industrialized countries versus non-industrialized countries. So for example, if we just take current economic growth, we are about 60 trillion, in the order of 60 trillion, the global economy. We're expecting by 2050 to approximately double, maybe triple. And this is sort of material progress. Of that, we have about 70% of that incremental growth is expected to come from non-OECD countries. And in 2050, that will lead to an average GDP per capita of within $12,000 to $15,000 per year, which is a pretty low level at the level at which you expect some fairly high requirements of energy and materials in order to provide basic living standards to people. So 1 billion people in the OECD countries would be responsible for half the global output in 2050, and 8 billion people would be responsible for the other half. So the extent of energy requirements and driven by material requirements will be significant in the developing world. And there obviously are concerns that we should be considering other dimensions of well-being there too, and that in fact there's profligate consumption and there's a need for more sustainable consumption in developing economies. But it is very hard to make the argument that you have to reduce consumption, absolute consumption, as you might make the argument in developing countries, in developed countries. And so that needs to be taken into account. And then the problem really is fundamentally about decarbonization of the economy, which is of course daunting, but it is in fact a problem. So to understand the challenge there, I just want to say a few words about what we understand from the IPCC reports, which essentially is a series of models that have tried to understand the requirements, if you will, of transforming the energy system to meet certain climate targets, so say 2 degrees C. Now, there's a lot of complex information there, but just very briefly, it involves several different models that try to simulate globally the energy system of the world and its interaction with the global economy, which is based on a very conventional and simplistic economic paradigm. And the focus here is really on technology and the transformation of technology and the economics cost associated with it. In a nutshell, what you find is there's obviously a range of outcomes, but there's about a mean reduction in consumption in order to achieve a 2 degrees C target of 5% by 2050, approximately as a median, 2% by 2020, and increasing a little bit beyond that. And if you think about it in economic terms, that actually doesn't seem very much. It's like delaying economic output or the consumption that you would consume today by a few years. Now, of course, this is based on a very, like I said, it's a very idealized environment. It's based on perfect social planner and ideal institutions. But that is what the economic cost is. But here's the rub. It involves investments of close to $1 trillion a year leading up to 2050 in energy efficiency and clean technologies. And a large share of them, more than half, would be in developing countries, because that's where you have a large growth of emissions, and that's also where you have sort of more opportunities for efficiency improvements. And so this is in direct contrast to what we talked about in terms of the capacity to pay in those countries. And this element is missing from this debate to some extent. The other aspect of there are a lot of caveats associated with the models. There's no politics, there's no institutional inertia, and feasibility is really in the techno-economic realm. So I think you'll hear a lot of criticisms from this panel about those scenarios, and certainly it's true that they may underestimate the challenges of a transition because they don't take into account social transformation and institutional challenges. But I want to point out that they also don't take into account some of the potential benefits to human well-being that I mentioned earlier. And there's growing research now in the importance of energy security, for diversifying fuels, for clean air, that are not accounted for in these GDP estimates that may actually underestimate the benefits of a transition. So I have some optimism that there is some compatibility, but it's very difficult to say. We have a lot of gaps in knowledge on both sides in terms of social transformation and in terms of understanding technology diffusion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Good morning. I have spent the last 40 years of my life working for sustainable development, for making the world less unsustainable, and I have failed. I started this work with my friends writing the Limits to Growth book in 1972, and since then trying to make people pass the proper legislation in order to make this world less unsustainable, and I have failed. The world is less sustainable today than it was in 1972 when I started working. And this is the background for my comments. My answer to the question, is global economic growth compatible with a habitable climate, is a resounding yes. This is fully possible in principle. It is the reason why we have the sad situation that we do have today, and the sad situation that we will have in the future, as described by my three debatants, is that human society has not been willing to implement the totally obvious solutions to the current problem. My thinking goes as following. It is, of course, possible to have a never-ending growth in GDP. The GDP is the economic value of the annual production of goods and services. And there is no reason in the world why this value, this number, can continue forever. The simplest way to show this is that I can give expensive talks in exchange for lovely paintings made by Sean. He gives me a painting and I give him a talk. And we can just assess the value of these exchanges higher and higher and higher. This is economic growth. This is the only operational definition of economic growth. It is that it is GDP growth. What needs to be limited on the finite planet is not GDP, but it is the ecological footprint. It is actually the annual resource use and the annual emissions of pollution. So what is a solution is one where the GDP continues to grow, because Sean and I entertain each other better and better, while at the same time we rebuild the energy capacity of the world from a fossil-based system to a system which is run by sun, wind, biomass, and hydro. So the central question, the question that should have been asked in this debate, is whether humanity is going to be able to reduce the ecological footprint of its activity. The GDP is just a blind alley, it's a red herring that people are discussing. The real issue is, are we able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP fast enough to get the total emissions of greenhouse gases going down? And the answer is that, in my mind, absolutely yes. Technically speaking, it's a piece of cake. It is actually largely to replace the fossil-based energy system with a renewable energy system. When you do the calculations slightly more perfectly, you get exactly the same answer as Narashima. It basically takes 1% of the GDP, the world's GDP, shifting it from dirty production to clean production to solve the whole problem. So all we need to do in order to solve the problem is to instruct those people that currently build fossil cars to build electric cars, to take those people and the capital that currently builds fossil-fired utilities, instruct them to make windmills and solar panels instead, and particularly in the third world, giving away the power. So what needs to be done on the ground is very simple, and it amounts to roughly 1% of the GDP. So this is financeable if you were willing to accept a 1% increase or 2% increase in your income tax level. That's what it costs to do the thing. The problem now is that although this is cheap, and although it is technically fully possible, it has not been done this far and will not be done, in my mind, over the next 40 years, because people are tremendously short-term. They're much, much more interested in keeping that 1% income tax themselves for consumption purposes, rather than paying them now in order to create a better world for people 30 to 60 years down the line. And that's the sad story. Thank you.
Kevin, would you like to comment on your fellow speakers?
Well, there's quite a high... Myself and Clive obviously take a very similar view. I think if you go along the panel here, then there's a more cautionary, some optimism, but more cautionary note here. And then to some extent, there's a slightly more gung-ho optimism towards the end of the panel, but with the caution note that we're not going to deliver. We're not going to deliver. But on the premise that it is possible, and I'm still not convinced by the argument that it is actually possible, and the reason for that is the simple word time. When we're talking about a habitable planet, we are talking about, in relation to climate change, we are talking here about getting our emissions out of the system very rapidly indeed. So we've been misled by the scientific community and by the policymakers for a long time that a focus on 2050 is important. 2050 has nothing to do with climate change. It is the carbon budgets, the total amount of CO2 put into the atmosphere, that is actually really important. And the problem there is that whilst we can make the change that Jürgen pointed out, that we can transition across to renewables, we cannot do that in the time frame that we have for carbon budgets aligned with 2 degrees centigrade. And that, I think, is why I disagree with his take on GDP. And I just put one example to that. We are now at a conference in what was a very new conference centre on a beautiful sunny day in Austria. And we have not even had the ingenuity to find ways to use daylight. So we are in here now with all of the lights on, using a microphone, on a day when we could have been using natural resources to light this room. And we will be locked into this building now for the next 20 to 100 years. And so that what we have done, we have removed the opportunity to deliver what Jürgen is laying out by the infrastructure we have put in place today. And therefore, I come to my position, which is quite different, Piers, in that there's the time frame dimension that means that we cannot have economic growth at an aggregate level with a habitable climate.
Thank you, Kevin. Claire?
Yeah, I would raise 2 points. I think that Jürgen's point about the flows and the way that GDP is a blind is in part true, and it's the same as what I was saying in terms of these are monetary flows. But in part it's not true. Because what growth and the whole rhetoric about growth is about a capital accumulating economy. It's capitalism, right? It's corporations taking resources and accumulating and extracting rents. Look at the real history of economic growth, the economies that have grown, that have accumulated capital. They are imperialist, they take over resources from third world countries, they exploit the resources of those countries, and they need to do that to maintain cheap energy supplies into their economy and materials into their economy. They are essentially physical. It's not the money flows. I agree, that's irrelevant, especially for the planet. The planet doesn't care about how much GDP goes up or how many financial flows are going on. It is concerned about the physical flows. China, the fastest growing economy of recent times, what did it do? Massive coal-fired power stations are being built on a massive scale. India, the same. Massive coal-fired power stations. Fossil fuels are essential to economic growth, real economic growth, capital accumulating economies. Doesn't matter whether they're in the east, west, north, south, wherever they are. They're the same thing, right? That is modernity. That is the problem. Windmills aren't going to save you. This is a systemic problem, right? Material and energy throughput. Yes, windmills require material and energy throughput. They also require a massive grid. They have all sorts of problems. They're being looked at to substitute directly into the existing system, not to change it. And this leads me to another issue, both mentioned by Kevin and Raoul, and which is about poverty. We need growth for the poor people, right? This is what we're continually told. Oh, no, we've got to reduce our growth, but the rest of the world, that is 80-90% of the planet. So 80-90% of the planet is going to grow at 7%, and we are going to reduce ours. I'm sorry, the maths that just doesn't add up, right? That is a disaster for the planet. That is material and economic growth on a basis that will kill us. And why do we need this economic growth? What is economic growth? Material and energy throughput, consumption, conspicuous consumption, throwaway cars, throwaway mobile phones. You know, technology is no use here. Mobile phones, on average, they get thrown away within 2 years, and they have a life expectancy of 5 to 7 years. They're thrown away, right? This is conspicuous consumption. And that's what you need, conspicuous consumption, for a growth economy. Fashion. Yeah, change your clothes because it's out of fashion, not because it's worn out. This is a growth economy.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, wow. Where to start? Well, I'll start with the GDP issue. I still think in some ways we need to be careful about what we're talking about. If you're concerned about the social organization, about the principles of capital accumulation and the effect it's having on society, I can agree with a lot of that. But that is a problem that may be manifest in society, even not considering the climate problem. I mean, we're concerned about growing inequality due to concentration of capital in the last 30 years, middle incomes is not rising, all of that. But what I'm interested in with regards to GDP growth in the climate context is material throughput and energy use. Now, what does that involve to bring people out of poverty? Now, I strongly, from everything I've seen, there is a strong requirement for energy use and materials to provide basic living standards. It is mixed in. It is mixed in with profligate consumption, for sure. And I have to admit that I'm working currently on a 3-year project to try to disentangle exactly these different that means what different services that are associated with minimal living, basic living standards, what's the material throughput and energy required for that, as opposed to just overall GDP growth? That's an important question. We don't yet have an answer, but I can guarantee you it involves a lot of growth, providing water, providing sanitation, providing food, providing clothing. Cell phones, incidentally, has hardly any impact on material use and climate compared to these other physical stock, buildings, solid construction so people don't live in slums. These would require incredible amount of energy increases. And yes, to decarbonize all of that in the next 30, 40 years is really impossible, one might say. But in any case, so that's one point. Overall, Kevin was talking about timing, and I do think if we are ambitious and if we do want to achieve the 2 degrees C target, most scenarios tell you that the industrialized world will have to start reducing emissions yesterday and in the developing world in 2020. And if we have to have any hope of achieving our target of 2 degrees C, we do have to make a strong movements towards decarbonization right now. So what matters in the next 50 years is really important. But at the same time, you're talking about increasing living standards for 80% of the planet, where you're going to see energy increases. So it has to be fundamentally about decarbonization. And the question is not whether you do it through reducing consumption or reducing technology. The issue is whether you're able to do it at all. Now, I do think consumption is important to tame, in a sense. And that's why I might disagree with Jorgen. So I think lifestyle issues, I'll take one example, eating meat, can have a significant effect, reduce GHGs by 20% on a cumulative basis, at least, and also free up tremendous amounts of land which can be used for biofuels and other sources that reduce mitigation costs. But other than that, lifestyle changes, are only a small part of the puzzle. We have to rely on technology because of the urgency of trying to meet this target.
Thank you, Nassim.
Very quickly. This is obviously a complicated issue, many-dimensional. In the year 2011, I spent 1 year trying to write a consistent picture of the future. It's a book that you should read called 2052. It is a forecast of what will actually happen over the next 40 years. It's not a recommendation. It is not one book with many scenarios. It is actually what I think idiot society is going to decide to do. We know a lot at this point in time about how decisions are made at the individual level, at the corporate level, at the national level, and not being done at the global level. And if you put this into a spreadsheet, basically, you can easily calculate what will happen over the next 40 years. This is done in this book, which is now out in umpteen languages and in umpteen 100,000 copies. And so it stands even 5 years after it was written. The important thing about what is likely to happen in the future is that there is the situation I said. We could have decided to do a lot of things that we will not decide to do. And as a consequence, interestingly, in 2050, first of all, there will be many poor people in the world. So the middle class, the global middle class in the year 2050 will not be 10 billion people, as most of you think. It will be 5 billion people. So demand in 2050 is going to be much lower than most people think, and much, much lower than it ought to have been in order to give a decent life for the world's poor. And so that means that the demand for resources, the demand for energy, etc., will be much lower in 2050 than most people think. As a consequence, the temperature in 2050 is only going to be plus 2 degrees centigrade, going up to plus 2.5 degrees centigrade in 2070, and then leveling off. The question now, I agree with you, that can one define a plus 2.5 degrees centigrade world, which is what we are going to get? Can we define this as habitable? And I think that your answer is correct. It's habitable for me, and it's not habitable for a large number of the poor people or the exposed people of the world. So this is a problem. Is it acceptable that we will only have 5 billion middle-class people in 2050 out of a total population of 7 billion? Is that acceptable? Well, it's acceptable for me, but it is not acceptable for the 2 billion that are still poor. So the main point in all of this is that things could be made very, very much better over the next 40 years if we had wanted to, but we will not decide to do so. The ways to do this, could we change fast enough, is Kevin's answer. My answer is yes. But it would have taken, for instance, the introduction of the one-child family in the rich world. It's rich people who's the basic problem. We need to accelerate the decline in the population of the rich world, rather than bothering with the Indian growth. My daughter consumes 30 times as much as a poor little child in India. It's my daughter which is the problem. It is not the Indian child which is the problem. So, and these things can be done in 40 years. We could draw down the rich world population dramatically. We could shorten work hours in the rich world so that production growth goes down, so that consumption growth goes down, so that it is easier to achieve reduction in the ecological footprint. We could do a number of those things, but we won't, because the voters are short-term and the capitalistic system is short-term. The voter votes for the lowest possible tax and the lowest number of regulations, and the market allocates capital to what happens to have the highest return on investment given current prices. Those two things are going to keep us on a track which creates lots of poverty in 2050 and plus 2.5 degrees centigrade in 2070. Thank you.
Thank you, Jürgen. So I think it's time to open the discussion. Would anyone like to ask a question, make a comment? If you can make your way to one of the microphones. There's one in the back and one here in the front. Anyone? Could you come to the microphone, please?
I'm going to end up criticizing you guys a little bit, so therefore I'd like to start off by saying I really enjoyed all of your comments. They're very thought-provoking and interesting. But in my opinion, I think we're splitting hairs a little bit here. We all agree there's a serious climate problem and we had to do something about it, even though you do have very diverse opinions about the problem and what we should do. And the way I see it is, this is the problem. We're not doing anything. We're not doing enough. Every day the planet becomes worse than the day before. And we sit and every few months we come together, we have a little talk with our climate scientists, but we're not doing enough. And so I think that's a real thing we need to talk about, is what can we do to improve the problem? Not just should we do it this way or that way and then nothing happens for another 10 years or 5 years. And the second thing I want to say is, overall I find the panel a little bit negative. And although I think you've been negative because that's it's true, it is a very negative situation right now. However, if that's a message we give to the outside world, it's going to be like frozen in the headlights. Nothing will happen. People will be too scared and just ignore the problem. So I think the message we need to give to the world needs to be far more positive and solution-orientated. And so, yeah, I just think we need to get out there and do something, and it needs to be something positive and solution-orientated.
Could I respond?
Okay, let's go.
You are absolutely right. And since I only had 5 minutes, I didn't get to the solution. So what is the solution when we're faced with short-term voters and a short-term market which is forcing us in the wrong direction, or at least not doing enough? The answer is, of course, to define policies that do solve the problem in the long term, but at the same time provides a short-term advantage to the majority of voters. So you need to come up with ideas where the voter says, boy, there is a short-term advantage to me in this, and then, by the way, it solves the problem. So one very trivial example, and then I'll give you a good example afterwards, is in our country, we would like people to buy electric cars because we have hydropower, so you could actually use electric cars rather than fossil cars in order to reduce emissions. How do we do this? We have 100% tax on all cars in Norway because we don't have a car industry, and consequently this is used for tax. So we decided 5 years ago to relinquish all taxes, the 100% tax on electric cars, which means that the electric car suddenly is 1/2 the price of the other cars. And consequently, Norway has at this point in time 10% of all the electric cars in the world. And Norway has 0.1% of the population. So this works. Why does it work? It, of course, works not because Norwegians are moral or ethically nice. They do this because it saves, the climate 30 to 60 years down the line. They do this because it saves them $50,000 in the short term when they buy their new car. So that's, that's one type of policy which is possible in democratic short-term society. A better one is the following. If you tax the rich, if you increase the taxes on the 10% richest in the people, 90% of the population has an advantage from this. So one simple policy that ought to be possible in society, because 90% would have a benefit, is to treble the taxes on the rich and earmark this 1 trillion that will, for saving the climate problem. Totally easy to do, if there was just someone who dared to try to push this policy. We have just finished a book which contains the 13 policies of this type, that have a short-term advantage and solves the problem in the long term. Read that one also.
Thank you.
Juliana,
comments, questions?
Juliana, can I just say something as well? Aside Jorgen just speaking for 30 minutes. Okay? Look, one thing is this negative, we mustn't give a negative message. This is crap, right? Really. I mean, dress it all up as Fluffy Bunny, make a nice cartoon, sell it through marketing, whatever. The real situation is the real situation. Why do we have to hide it? When there's a war, when there's fear being spread by the security services because it serves their express needs, then there's no, let's all tell a nice message. No, it's all horror and blood and murder. And look at it on the TV screens. Oh, that doesn't affect the policy, does it? No, that changes the policy. But when it's the environment, oh no, let's tell a nice fluffy story about it because people will get scared. Fear is used by politicians and society to purposeful ends. We are scientists, social scientists and natural scientists. Why tell me I should lie? I will not lie about the state of the world and the way I see the system. The other thing is, what about this negative kind of view that Jorgen has of human nature? That we're all self-interested, that we can only do things if we get payoffs for it, and so on and so forth. This is also rubbish. Yes, people are self-interested, but they're also social beings. They want to socialize. Marketing, I'm at an economics and business university. We know a lot about marketing. Marketing is all about selling lifestyles. It's about making social impacts on people. You want to be part of the in-group. This is social behavior, right? That's what it's about. This is what social transformation is about as well, getting into the social aspects of it. So I think these are actually missing these kinds of things.
Thank you, Clive. So I'd like to get a few more questions and comments in before we go back to the panel. So if you want to make your way to the middle, over here, I think you were first.
Okay, thanks guys, nice talks. But about GDP, you say that it's totally irrelevant, but I would like to point out that it's like our politicians are following the GDP. For example, in my country, nowadays we have like big cuttings because our GDP is not growing enough. So what I'm saying that we need a change of economical system. We have to follow some other number than GDP to have a real change in the biophysical world. So if you could comment that. How to do that economical change?
Thank you. Can I just get a few more questions before we come back? Any? Want to? Someone in the back?
Yeah, Casper here from Newcastle University. I can't help being really disappointed by these sorts of discussions generally. I mean, year after year, we see the same things being discussed. And I mean, it's echoing what the first speaker, the first question was about, really, about the lack of search for solutions. You sort of think we've got here, however many, 16,000 geoscientists, and we're talking about policy. There's nothing wrong with talking about policy, but surely we can look for other solutions. Is the only solution to climate change reducing emissions? Personally, I think not. Yet that seems to be highly under-discussed in these sorts of arenas. Shouldn't we be looking in more inventive ways of using our knowledge as opposed to spending all our time criticising economists when they're not even here to answer their case? Well, yeah, okay, you may be, but you're
Maybe I am.
No, yes, but your attack on a discipline that was unanswered just didn't seem to be a very useful way of approaching the subject. You know, we're actually talking about something very real. Shouldn't we be searching for solutions? it really does feel as if the discussion is just not going in that direction over and over again, year after year after year. Not just this panel, and in fact, to see it reflected more in the audience than in the panels on some of these debates, because we've had other debates on these sorts of things, you know, that geoscientists are just afraid to act.
Can you provide an example of what type of solutions you're talking about?
Well, some of the attempts at geoengineering, at least investigating those a bit further, you know, there's a real fear of even taking those investigations forwards. You know, some of the more obvious technologies like cloud seeding, why not at least try the experiments? Why not at least investigate how realistic they are? That's just one example, but you know, I think it's quite an interesting one that people aren't willing to take forward the full-scale experiments. And it's the people here who could actually take those sorts of things forward.
Thank you. Any more comments, questions?
Yeah, I want to respond to the idea with fear, and I'm not aware of fear leading to any good decisions in history, and so maybe we shouldn't try, like, yes, it has been used, but it hasn't been used for anything good, or in my opinion, like, if you can rate what has come from that, it hasn't improved. Fear of war has just led to more war in some way. And the other thing is, adding to what you just said, we talk a lot about policies and what policies would be good, and yes, it stays exactly very hypothetical, because we aren't the ones who are implementing the policies. Like, I probably won't ever sign some policy or whatever. We should maybe think about what is it that we can actually do, and or wouldn't there be some effective possibilities that scientists can actually change something, except from like improving efficiency and all this magical stuff that would ensure keeping our standards and yeah, things like that. I don't want to talk further on that, but yeah, it seems like it's a kind of magical thing to all these inventions that we will have. Maybe, yeah. I don't have the solution, so yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much for your comment. So, so we had GDP not irrelevant, let's look for solution twice, the use of fear. Narashima, maybe you would like to...
Well, I'll just make a couple of points on this fear business. I think what I was hearing from Clive and what I would want to say is, we're talking about realistic portrayal from our understanding of science of risk. It's not fear, it's risks. It's the risks that we're exposing society to. And it's also really important to understand that there's a fundamental moral problem here. And you just have to accept that you have a disconnect. The emitters, the ones who are emitting the most, are not the ones who are affected the most. And so you have this distance between those who are responsible for the problem and those who are being affected by the problem. And that's fundamentally a justice problem. And we need to understand that. And until people are sensitive to that, they won't necessarily believe that it's in their interest to act. And that brings me to the solution. We want solutions. I think it's clearly political. We need to act not just as consumers, but as voters. And we're talking about fundamentally decarbonization with other things around it, which is basically hundreds of billions of dollars of investment being moved from people who are currently benefiting from the system to another set of characters who will benefit from the system. And that involves a humongous political shift. And that can only be carried out in democracies if people support it. And so that is what we need, is for people to act as voters. And to me, that is the most important thing.
Thank you. Kevin, what do you...
Well, I'll let you discuss the GDP one as an economist. I'll come to the one about whether we should try chemotherapy over giving up smoking. That's probably my concern here, is that people like us, and I'm guessing, I don't know you at all, but you're from Newcastle, you came here, I doubt you cycled, I didn't either. No doubt you were on the train with me. So you know, we are the high emitters. and that we then say the solution to the problem, which is you're talking about the solution, I don't think it is a solution at all, but the solution to the problem is to find a technical fix that allows us to carry on flying around the world to events like this. I find there's something, going back to the comments about there being a moral dimension to this, that to me epitomises the moral problems that we have, that we think that the response to climate change has to be something that allows us to carry on doing what we're doing with some sticking plaster that we're going to stick over the top of it. So I find that concerning. At the same time, I think we should be looking at these issues, but I'm also a bit surprised by your view that we're not looking at them. They dominate the integrated assessment modelling community scenarios. So they are the hidden technology that what we are relying on now. The Paris Agreement for 1.5 degrees C particularly is reliant on these technologies. So the policymakers and the scientific community has just absorbed them as if they will work. So actually my concern is almost the other way around to yours, that they are far too dominant, but they have been hidden. So I don't like that particular route forward. And the idea that, going back to a number of the points here, this idea of fear and hope and so forth, but I take this sort of view, I think we shared that a moment ago actually, it's more about reality, as best we can understand the reality. It's not whether it's pessimistic or optimistic. It's just trying to say this is where we are. And if we as the scientific community can't do that without fear of being ridiculed, of being too negative, then that is a real concern. The globe requires the scientific community to do robust analysis and communicate it vociferously. It doesn't require us to sugarcoat it or to make it worse than it is. But I think the situation is that dire. So therefore, we have to be honest. We are in a dire situation. But there's real hope then. And I come a different position from Jürgen and more towards Clive here, that I don't think human psychology is set in stone. The particular model that we have today is tailoring our psychology towards supporting that particular model. That's sort of, the economic, the neoliberal model, however you want to define it. But actually, human psychology is much richer than that. We need to find ways to tap in to the other components of our lives as citizens, not just as consumers. And I think if we try to find ways to do that, then I think there is real hope. But at the moment, we are still locked into technical solutions that fit into the existing model, rather than actually trying to think that this is much more about culture. And as an engineer, it's quite hard to say this, because I think I like engineering solutions to things. But I think this is much more about issues of culture and value than it is anything to do with technology.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think that my colleagues have already addressed the fear issue. I just say that my point was, in addition to their points, was not that fear is used successfully, and I think you're right, it's used for war and so on and so forth, but it's used. That's the point. And that was my issue, is that we're always told, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't have a negative message, and yet there's negative messages used in society quite a lot. So it was just that. But I it's the realist aspect, it's the science and so on, and we should try to say what we believe is going on. That was my point. In terms of the issue, Eastern Europe, Russia, wherever, being driven by the growth addiction, and also the West, and this is very, very dominant. And it is an addiction, right? The politicians are locked into this, and it's all the indicators built around it. And so they're going to change it to happiness now, but they aren't going to change anything fundamentally in the system. It doesn't matter whether you measure it with happiness or money or whatever it is, it's the same basic system of capital accumulation. This raises issues about the structure of the economy, the structure of the world in which we're living, right? So we've created a set of structures which have locked us into this, and you have to break those structures. We have to break modernity. This is why geoengineering is a load of crap, because it doesn't do anything about the fundamental system. It just substitutes another miracle technology into an existing system, which is totally exploitative. You look at what goes on in the third world with the degradation of goals. Poverty, right? Let's look at the World Bank's indicators of poverty. Taking people out of poverty is giving them $1.10 so they can say that they've got out of poverty. What they've taken is the rural population, grabbed their land, stick them into urban poverty like Victorian England living in slums, and say now they've got $1 or $1.10, so now they've got living standards. Whereas previously they lived in a rural area, okay, maybe not brilliant, but it was a damn sight better than living in a polluted slum in Beijing. So agency is the other side of this, right? Let's be positive. I mean, there are lots of things that all of us can do. How many people flew here? Do you give a shit about climate change? Sorry, so you don't have to put your hand up. Don't embarrass yourself. I mean, people don't do what they say they're concerned about. If you're really concerned about climate change, Jürgen, stop flying. 40 years. 40 years and nothing's happened. Oh, no one's done anything. Well, do something yourself. I mean, you know, become a vegetarian. As Kevin pointed out, there are lots of things you can do as an individual to take action. You know, cycle to work, support your colleagues, try and stop parking spaces being built at your workplace. There's loads of stuff you can do. You know, turn off the lights when you leave the building. Don't rely on the technology. I mean, you know, try and get them to hold the conference outside in the open air in the sunny park. I mean, there's tons of stuff you can do as an individual, right? And it can be very empowering, and it can also change the action of others. Do that. Try.
Thanks, Claude. Any more questions, comments? I haven't had anyone from the back yet. Anyone from the back? Can you please make your way to the microphones over here? Can't really see.
Hey, Johannes from Sweden. I think it's a bit interesting with this concept about fear, and I'm thinking about the media as well, because at least this last year it feels like fear is kind of working for those who are interested. I mean, I'm talking about terrorists and all that situation. That's what's been dominating the media, and in my opinion, that's kind of they're using the scare tactics to actually win and to talk about the things that, I mean, to make them talk about them, when in fact this is what we should be talking about. So just I think that's interesting, and also feels very, yeah, it feels like if fear seems to be working for some people, and I'm wondering if you have any comments on how to tackle and what we can do about media and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Over there. Yeah.
Hi, Hans Brenna, University of Oslo. I was at this town hall meeting on Monday about communicating climate change science thing hosted by the Oxford University Press, just over there. And they were really on this don't use the negative message media science thing. So, and I'm always, I can understand what they're saying, and it's, you need to try to not make people terrified, but I always feel that it's very unrealistically hopeful, and I really share some of you guys' pessimism, especially Clive's, or maybe your not negativity, but that we really need to say how important it is and how big a problem this really is for the world. And I'm scared that that will just disappear if we go into this everything has to be positive vibe.
Thank you very much. Yeah, over there, please. Yeah.
Hi, Anna Harper from University of Exeter. I have a question about climate targets, and if we think 1.5 degrees is unrealistic and 2 degrees is unlikely, is it harmful actually to have these climate targets that we think are not realistic? And so you end up having a lot of emphasis on meeting these climate targets that we probably aren't going to meet, and then you have this negativity that kind of cycles over itself. Should we have more emphasis on adapting to the climate change that we know is going to happen? I mean, I think there's a balance between the adaptation and the mitigation, and do you think that there's been too much focus on one or the other, or where do you think the most useful use of our resources is? Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe one more? One more? Here in the front.
Sheila Peacock, United Kingdom. Just want to say about what I, as an individual sort of scientist, have been able to do. I borrowed an infrared camera from the local council and took it to a few houses and took pictures and discussed thermal insulation with their owners. And this, I should tell you about one of these occasions, which was really quite desperate because the house was so poorly built. The central heating was going full blast. There were holes that were letting the sunlight through. There was about 25 millimeters of insulation, a layer of slate on one side, a layer of plasterboard on the other, and that was the wall. And the occupant of this house was a very nice young man, and his wife was 4 days from due to have her second baby. And so I was able to, my colleague who went with me and I was able to say, you should do this, this, and this to your house, all of which were very expensive. And then my colleague went on to say, well, it's not going to do much good even if you do it, because you're in the middle of a terrace unless your neighbours do it as well. And it was just, well, we went away feeling very, very depressed. But I think it was something that we as scientists were able to do, just as an example of positive action a special action that as a scientist I was able to do. But if you do it, be warned, this is what you're going to find. And I'll leave you to the economics of how on earth this house was one of, I'm trying to think how many hundreds of similar 1970s houses that were thrown up in a desire to try to get people out of London into this suburban area where I live. And this is just the one town. There must be hundreds of towns around London with the same kind of bad housing. And this is in a developed country, quote, unquote.
Thank you. Can we take one more? Yeah, over there.
Irina Medvedeva. I'm a physicist from Russia. This discussion seems to me a little one-sided, because all the speakers, all the opinions were coming from this, how to say, the white rich world, which represent 1/7 of the whole world population, and actually there were no opinion from other 6/7 of the world. What those people, what they are thinking about this? And of course, I don't want to be too pessimistic because it discourages us, and I agree with all the opinions which were said here. But as I maybe would be interesting, this in Russia, for example, people don't care much about, mostly like average person, doesn't care so much about environmental problems. Because the problems, and Russia is not the poorest country, naturally, so it's like somewhere in the middle. But the first priority is, of course, the economical interests of people. And so we must think over about those 6 billion of people who have different concerns. And as a scientist, I quite agree that this, of course, we must formulate some priorities. First of all, realistic, scientific understanding what is going on. Don't play with like emotions, pessimism, optimism. We must be realistic. There must be some objective picture, overall picture. But as scientists, as a physicist, for example, and other from natural sciences, techniques, I would say that our role, which is evidently is very important, to supply people, humankind, with a cheap, affordable means, technical means for this environmental, for developing sustainable development. So look, for example, mobile phones are very cheap now. So all the people use it. In Africa, poor people using mobile phones, cell phones. So the main, I firmly believe that the main goal of this rich white world to supply the whole humankind by the technical things which can make really reduce this harmful impact on the environmental. Not money, but technologies. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's come back to the panel now. In the interest of time, maybe shall we focus on the climate targets? I mean, there was another question about communication, fear, media, but we kind of touched upon already. So maybe, Narasimha, do you want to comment on the climate target question?
Yes, I would like to. And I thought I was trying to express the opinion of those 6 billion people, but I'll tell you again what I think they're thinking. And this ties into the climate target, which is that you've had 150 years to build up your living standard till now, and now we are expected to technology leapfrog and lifestyle leapfrog into some kind of world that we've never experienced before, you clean up your mess. That's what they're thinking. Which brings me to the question of ambition. So I think we had some questions earlier. Let's be realistic. Let's look for realistic targets. And it also ties into what we've heard before, that we need some lifestyle changes. Let's turn off the lights. Let's maybe take the train instead of flying. All of these are good and they're important, but we really need to understand ambition. The world has agreed that we want to achieve 2 degrees C and no more, because anything worse would be dangerous interference with climate change that will have significant effect on human life and suffering. And there's a danger that we take these small actions on lifestyle and then we get complacent that we've done our bit. And the problem is that you may not see the effects of that, first of all, as future generations, but as future generations in other countries. And so we have to be strongly committed to this level of commitment that the globe has really agreed to. And it really involves a lot more than you just taking the train tomorrow. It involves you voting so that we can try to shift the energy system towards low-carbon futures. That's really not avoidable. And if we do not do that, we will be basically committing ourselves to significant human suffering and loss in the future.
Thank you. I think, unfortunately, we must move on to our concluding statements because we're running out of time a bit. Do you want to briefly comment, Kevin? You're looking... Yes, go ahead.
Just very quickly on the idea, are these targets actually unhelpful? Remember, these are not simple temperature targets. They are actually a rate of change target. 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 degrees centigrade, we're talking about across the century. So they are about rates of change. And the point about having a rate of change target is that it is a rate of change that allows the rest of the system, whether it's the ecosystems or whether it's human systems, to evolve with that rate of change. So I think they are very important. They are also very important for thinking of issues of adaptation. We have to know where the world is heading to know what to adapt for. To build a sewage system for 2 degrees centigrade, if you live near the sea, is different from building a sewage system for 4 degrees centigrade. So I think these temperature targets are actually very important for informing adaptation as much as they are mitigation. And just a minute, it's not, I think, I'm not suggesting small changes in lifestyles by people like us. I'm suggesting very significant changes in lifestyles. And to give some sort of quantification for that, something like a 70% reduction in our carbon dioxide emissions from people like us in about a decade. Now, I think if we ally that with substantial technical adjustment on the supply side, we have an outside chance of 2 degrees centigrade. But I think we can actually power down how much energy we use by that sort of order of magnitude.
Juliana,
thank you very much.
Can I just 30 seconds to?
Sure.
Because I think there's
Go
three
ahead.
interesting questions. Like, one is the woman talking about her experience of trying to do something right in the UK. Look what's happened in the UK. UK has devastated its public investment programme, neoliberalisation, and it all comes down to individuals. It's you or it's that poor, the family in the house. It's their responsibility. This is underinvestment in public sector, and that should be reversed. Adaptation. Adaptation came on the agenda after mitigation. It's a cop-out to a large extent. Why do we need adaptation? Because we've done nothing on mitigation. It's become bigger and bigger. Of course, we now have to adapt. We have no choice. And the media, if you look at the way the media operates and the media is controlled, the vast majority of the media is servicing the financial sector, the financial and banking sector. And that is their primary concern, and that's what they report.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much for all your comments and questions. Unfortunately, we'll have to come to the concluding statements by our panel. So maybe this time we can start in reverse order. Jorgen, would you like to tell us about your impressions, your thoughts on the debate?
So I would like to make 3 points. First of all, the climate challenge cannot be solved through individual action. Voluntary individual action. This requires collective action. This is society at large which need to act. It is not enough that we stop flying or eating white meat, etc., etc. What needs to be done is only one thing. We need to close down all the uses of coal, oil, and gas and replace them with renewable sources. Sun, wind, hydro, and sustainable biomass. That's the one thing that needs to be done. And this can only be done through legislation that forces investors to build expensive renewable capacity instead of building the cheap coal, oil, and gas. And in order to get this to happen, a majority of the people need not to stop eating red meat or, you know, do these other things. They need to vote for parties that are willing to increase the tax level and to pass the legislation which forces investors to invest in clean energy. Once the whole fossil system has been shifted from dirty to clean, there are some additional things that need to be done in waste and agriculture, but they are minor compared to the energy shift. And when you think about how difficult it is to make the energy shift, you understand my conclusion that I'm afraid this will not happen fast enough in order to avoid the plus 2.5 degrees. So that's my first comment. The second comment, of course, I'm sorry I was not so clear. The reason why we are white men up here is that it is the 1 billion rich people in the world that need to start the ball. We are the ones that need to change our energy systems into those renewable systems. And we need to do one other thing. We need to let the poor world develop as well as they can. And we should build and give away sun, wind, and biomass and methane, you know, capacity to the villages. We should build the windmills and the solar panels and give them away so we get electricity into the village. That's the other thing that needs to be done collectively at large scale, because this electricity in the village is what actually increases well-being in the short term in the poor world. And my third comment is on fear. Norwegians cannot say the word fear. The important thing about fear is that the real fear in rich world is fear against the solutions. The fear of the solutions, the necessary solutions, are much, much bigger in our part of the world than fear of global warming. And the best example I can think of to get that message across is my book 2052, which is actually a clear and scary warning about what we will decide, you know, what kind of future we are going to create for ourselves over the next 40 years. Do you know how many copies of that book was sold in UK, United States, and Australia, who are the core liberal democracies of the world? 17,000. Do you know how many copies of that book was sold in China? Since the book calls for authoritarian, strong action. 50,000. In Japan, 30,000. In Germany, 30,000. So the point is that the rich world, dominated by the UK, the United States, and Australia, you know, the true right-wing conservative countries, capitalist countries of the world, they don't like the message. They fear, you know, the need to change so much that it drowns the fear of the warming. Thank you.
Thank you.
I literally wholeheartedly agree with what Jürgen just said, almost all of it. I just add a couple of points. We're talking about what we can do, and I'm thinking about the questions people are asking. Well, are we self-serving? Are we social animals? And I think those are elements of both. What's important is we've learned from social psychology that certain things work and certain things don't work for influencing behavior. And yes, it's true. We've learned to some extent that making people feel bad about what they've done doesn't make them act well, and that probably the most effective mechanism has been social peer effects. And so can we use that to our advantage? And I think about the media. As Clive said earlier, we basically have media selling lifestyles to people, and we've known for a long time that the things we buy are really a form of social communication. We don't actually need those things. And so what if we can make a low-carbon economy sexy? And I truly believe that there's potentially a social tipping point when if enough people adopt change, and I mean as voters also, that it is possible to have a true shift in how we view the economy, especially if we think about the fact that not even considering the climate impacts or the avoided climate impacts, there are a lot of co-benefits that we really have not yet quantified, and we are in the process of quantifying. That with regard to air pollution, with regards to the negative effects of overconsumption, and so there are direct benefits potentially to be earned by us as well. On the lifestyle issue, to achieve the kind of lifestyle changes that Kevin said, I just want to point out that that kind of drastic change would involve things like pulling down the building infrastructure before its useful life is over, replacing old buildings that would need to therefore be efficient. If we retrofit things only when the useful life is over, that will not be fast enough. Those are the kind of drastic changes that we need to achieve the decarbonization that we're heading towards. And that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm going to disagree with Jürgen for sure. I mean, what he does is he creates a dichotomy. He says there's structure and there's agency, basically, if I rephrase it slightly in political science terms. And what he says is because we have to change the structure, we can't do anything as agents. And then he asks us as agents to vote to change the structure. It's a totally inconsistent argument for a start. But also, there's a hell of a lot you can do as an agent, as I've pointed out. An agent's actions can change the structure. So there's an interaction. It's not an either-or situation, it's a both. I agree that we need to change the structure, fundamentally change the political economy and the structure of it. That's not a question. But that doesn't mean that individual action is a waste of time and meaningless. And it's also an ethical necessity that you take action. Secondly, the growth system. Thank you. The growth system. Look, it's a systemic problem. Narrowing this down to climate change is a big mistake. Putting in new energy systems and saying, oh, we're going to have lots of electric cars in Norway, isn't that great? What are the electric cars made of? They still need roads. They still have batteries. They still use energy. They still use all the materials. Where are the low entropy material resources coming from? They're being exploited from third world countries. Norway is an oil exporting nation that can afford to do this. It builds its electric cars on the back of selling fossil fuels abroad. That's what it does, right? And also, look at the whole system, right? The whole system has to change. It's a military-industrial system. Norway also sells weapons, right, into the military-industrial system. It also gives a peace prize. Oh, well, great. Cost-benefit analysis, right? So then the other issue is poverty and development, right? This has come up several times here. What's going to happen? We need the growth for the poor people. They've got to have growth. Growth is not about addressing poverty. Redistribution would address poverty in a damn sight quicker way. And we don't do redistribution. And the nations that committed in the 1970s to send money to third world countries, 0.2% of GDP or whatever it was, have never fulfilled outside of 3 Scandinavian countries and one Luxembourg, I think, or somewhere like that. It's like they haven't taken action, right? Redistribution, not more growth for more rich people in a minority. And then I would just finish by saying, let's look at who pushes growth. Who is behind growth? The military-industrial complex pushes growth, right? It's securing resources, imperialism, taking over countries, China investing in Africa, America taking over the Middle East, destabilization, Russia moving into the Caucasus, whoever. Geopolitical situation. We are in a situation of resource wars.
Thank you.
I'd like to echo Clive's point about individual action is really important. It's not just important for the emissions themselves, it's much more important as an example, as a catalyst to others around us. So I completely disagree with Jürgen here. This is not about top-down versus bottom-up. It's about a partnership between the two. And if people like us do not demonstrate how we can have an EGU conference next year that's much lower carbon emissions than this year, and the year after that is lower carbon again, then we are letting down the policymakers who need to have examples. So individual action catalyses collective action. They are a partnership, and they are essential. I think we touched on, someone talked a little bit earlier about the issues of fear and narratives and so forth. I think we need multiple narratives. This idea that we mustn't speak in the language of fear or whatever that might be, I think is really misunderstands the diversity of how we all engage in issues. We need multiple narratives. That's why and we don't need that from the scientific community. We really need the arts and humanities community to engage with us about how do you translate this message into multiple narratives for other people to engage with. We, by and large, scientists, people like us, are not particularly good at engaging outside of our own particular realms. The odd exception, no doubt, but by and large, we're good at talking to each other. So we need to engage much more, I think, with the arts and the humanities about how do we describe the sorts of worlds that we are talking about. I slightly disagree. There are many disagreements on the panel, but about this lifestyle issue again. I think lifestyles, when I'm talking about 70% reductions, I'm not talking about ripping down fabric. I'm talking about actually lifestyles within the existing infrastructure. We also have to do a lot about the fabric as well, and we can discuss issues of retrofit, which I may have some disagreements with you on as well. I think it'd be much faster than you suggest. But the lifestyle change is about, if we do cut back on how often we fly, if we do reduce the amount of meat we consume, if we do actually buy smaller cars or preferably use public transport and cycle and maybe just travel less, all of these things can dramatically reduce our carbon footprint and give very good examples outside that. So I think a 70% reduction is viable, but it's not enough. And therefore it has to go along with technological improvements and developments as well, most of which those technologies are there. We're not short of those opportunities. They still exist. And maybe that's just me as a hopeful engineer. And finally, I'll come back to the idea that in the end, I think that meaningful hope, if it is to be realised at all, just comes about simply from action. And that if we really want to feel better that we are making some improvement, then we have to start to act. So we've had plenty of discussion over the last 25 years, but it's about time that we as individuals and as collectives starting to act, regardless of the tragedy of the commons, the prisoner's dilemma issues, regardless of whether other people are doing it. Someone has to step forward and start to demonstrate what can be delivered. And there's no reason why our community, with all the information at its fingertips, could not be that first community that demonstrates that action is possible.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, thank you all again for joining us this morning, and thank you for your great comments and questions. And would you please join me in thanking our panel once more?